The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, we'll get some practical family advice for those trying to create more unconventional families. First up, we hear from Canadian trumpet player Jens Lindemann about how he lost almost everything in the devastating wildfires around Los Angeles. That's next on The Agenda. The fires in Los Angeles have captured the empathy and attention of people all over the world. Canada has sent water bombers to help extinguish the fires. And of course, many Canadians live in Southern California. Jens Lindemann is a world-renowned trumpet player. He was a member of the Canadian Brass, has an honorary degree from Hamilton's McMaster University, is an honorary fellow at the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto, has the Order of Canada, and tonight finds himself homeless. His house in Pacific Palisades is gone. Jens Lindemann joins us now from a friend's home in Palm Springs, California. Jens, it is so good to see you again. I'm sorry under these circumstances, but let's get into this, shall we? Some of the background here. When did you move to California in the first place?
Jennifer and I, my wife and I, moved to California in 2001, right after I left the Canadian Brass, and we moved to this particular area of LA, the Pacific Palisades, that has been so horribly devastated this week.
What did you love about the Palisades that made you want to move there?
It was quiet. It's near the ocean. It's not near the studios. We lived up in a place called the Palisade Highlands, and when you came down into the village of Pacific Palisades, it felt like a community. One of the things that's very difficult about Los Angeles is making the city feel like it's a community, because I describe LA as a country and not a city. But the Palisades was one of these beautiful little enclaves where you were around people that lived there all the time, and it was our home. These were our neighbors. I mentioned to somebody a couple of days ago that Gene Levy, who we were also very familiar with and happens to be a friend of mine, he was the honorary mayor, still is the honorary mayor of Pacific Palisades. He lost everything. People like Gene Levy are not stars and celebrities in our eyes. We're just people that live there. And everybody is devastated for everybody else. It's a very hard thing to describe, Steve.
Well, you were good enough to send me some pictures of not only your former house, but the community as well. So I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osman, just to take us through some of those pictures to start with. And there we go. That was your house, with that beautiful adobe roof, and fair to say this was your dream home, Jens?
It was. That's where it's hard to see it right now. I mean, it's hard for me to look at it. Yeah, that's the garage I came into, and then it overlooked a beautiful canyon, which was idyllic and quiet and silent. And it was, that was what we looked at. And that's how we escaped from the daily realities of very busy lives, Steve.
It looks absolutely idyllic. When did you have to abandon your dream home?
We had to leave the same day. There were some photographs I took the minute that the wildfire started. It was a puff of smoke, and interestingly, Steve, and perhaps it's been reported already, this is not an uncommon occurrence in Southern California, but these things are dealt with very, very quickly. So I routinely just took my camera and snapped a couple of pictures, and then 5 minutes later, I took another picture from the house across the road where I am, and it was a roaring inferno, completely different. And within 5 or 10 minutes after that, helicopters had shown up, and we knew we had to get ready to leave. And the problem was, as has also been, I'm sure, reported, there were about 200 cars that jammed up at the bottom of the mountain hill. There were flames on either side, and cars were abandoned as people literally ran for their lives to get off the hill. We were stuck up at the top of the mountain for another 4 to 5 hours before the fire department bulldozed those vehicles to the side, and then we were escorted out one by one by emergency personnel.
So initially, you couldn't get out, is that right?
No, we couldn't leave, and it was quite terrifying because you're out with all of your neighbors and you're wondering what's going on. And again, it seems surreal because you see the fire and the winds are going in a certain direction away from you. It doesn't make any sense. And then it started to get very real when everybody's telephone lines, their cell service and televisions went down, and we realized we couldn't communicate the way we would normally communicate with anybody else. That's when it got serious. And where we live, Steve, there's a lot of elderly folks There are shut-ins there that you're knocking on neighbors' doors to make sure that they have some form of getting out. There were people who were at work, who weren't at home, who had pets who were left behind, and we were all trying to break into others' homes to get these animals out and just get off the mountain. There was an urgency that was surreal. It's the only way I can describe it.
How much time, and we are going to show some pictures that you took of the blaze once it takes place, but I need some more background first. How much time did you have to essentially gather whatever you could gather in that amount of time before leaving?
Well, again, the idea is normally that you should be prepared at all times to leave and have a kit to prepare to leave a mountain in case of anything like this, but you're not really thinking that way. The actual window of time, once we realized we couldn't leave the mountain and were getting quite nervous for a few hours, when we did get an emergency signal saying that they were going to escort people out of the mountain, off the mountain rather, 5 to 7 minutes, you ran through your house and grabbed the last things you really thought. Now, this was urgent. It wasn't just your passport and your papers. I mean, anything that was important to you or thought was important, within 5 minutes, you had to make that decision.
Okay, as promised, let's take a look at some of the video and still pictures that you sent from after the fires took place. Sheldon, if you would, let's roll it. This, I don't know. Jens, can you see this and can you talk us through it?
I can see it. This is literally across the street from where I live, and right behind that house is the canyon, which was shooting up with flames, and you can see the helicopters dousing water on it, but it was too little and too late.
So that's all gone now?
That ridge is all gone, yes.
All right, we're going to continue to look at some of the still pictures as well. That looks horrifying. What's going on here?
Steve, that picture was taken 5 minutes after I walked up the road to take a first picture, and it was just a small cloud of smoke, and then it became that roaring inferno within 5 minutes. I really don't know how to describe it. I know it's an overused description to say it seemed like a scene out of a movie, except that you were living it. And that picture was the first one. It was fairly quiet. I know it looks almost ominous, but this is not an irregular occurrence. But the breakout of flames, that was something nobody has ever experienced up there.
And the last one we have here.
That one's difficult to look at, Steve. That was my home, and that was our view, and that's where we built so many memories. It's so much more than just stuff. I know people have said that there are things that you can rebuild, but there's something that is taken from you that I haven't been able to quantify yet in my heart and soul.
Jens, when you know that you have basically 5 minutes to gather 25 years worth of whatever you can get your hands on, how do you know what to pick first?
I have a collection of about 35 trumpets. I managed to grab 8 of them. The very first one I grabbed was this one. It was given to me by one of my heroes and mentors, Doc Severinsen. And interestingly, the second trumpet I grabbed was my Canadian brass trumpet, the one that I played when I worked with the group for 6 years. You just grab the things that they mean something to you in a way that you can't really describe, and you don't even know why you're grabbing them. It seems surreal because there's still a side of you that thinks, well, I'll just be back up here later to pick up the rest of my stuff, and this is just an exercise. And then when you realize there's nothing left, you start dealing with the emotional and literal reality of what that means moving forward. And it's still too fresh. It's just been a couple of days, and we're not ready to quite address that yet.
I guess we should say for the younger people watching us right now, Doc Severinsen, who I think is probably almost 100 years old right now,
97 years young and still at it, and he was a mainstay of the Tonight Show band, a trumpeter extraordinaire with incredible flamboyance. We played with him while I was with the Canadian Brass, and he's a hero to all of us, and was since I was a kid, and that's why that particular trumpet was the first thing I grabbed.
Now, I can't help but notice you've got your snowflake on. As we mentioned in the introduction, you've got the Order of Canada. Did you have it on when you left, or did you have to grab it, or what?
I didn't have it on. Interesting that you should ask that, because I grabbed this coat. The Order of Canada is easily the most humbling moment of my life to have received such a distinction, and I'm very proud to wear it wherever I go. And people will often ask me about the little snowflake on the lapel. Stephen, it gives me a chance to talk about Canada. Canada has given me everything: my education, my upbringing, my friends, my everything about Canada is what I now represent moving forward. And it's interesting, yeah, the trumpet, this blazer, and that's it. Beyond that, a couple of papers and passports. So.
Jens, do you have a storage locker where you have other stuff collected?
No, Steve. It's all gone. All the things that we have, it's rubble. In fact, I still have a trumpet student who graduated from UCLA, who is now fighting the front lines of the fire. And incidentally, those are the real heroes right now, Steve. We've lost everything, and that's a very sad thing. And yet there are people doing 18 to 20-hour shifts fighting those lines, including my former student. He was the one who ultimately called and said, "You can make any decision you would like, but if it were me, I would leave that mountain now." And the teacher became the student, and the student became the teacher. We are so grateful for those people who are imperiling themselves every minute, and this is not over yet. The winds are still whipping up, and this fire is not finished. So, we're just trying to figure out what to do next.
I'm going to take a second here to do a little background on why you are where you are right now, because you're at a friend's home in Palm Springs. And I will set this next question up by saying that I know you've played in some pretty impressive places over the years, Carnegie Hall, whatever. To me, your most impressive performances were as the guy who played the trumpet to rev up the crowd in the Northlands Coliseum in Edmonton when the Oilers were a massive dynasty back in the day. And by putting that background on the record, maybe now you can tell us where you're at.
Back in the day, and maybe rising from the proverbial ashes, if I could say it that way. Yes, I grew up in the 80s watching the Oilers when they were dominant, and Glenn Sather, of course, was the coach. When I posted this on social media, Steve, I knew we would get, as all people would get, an outpouring of affection and concern. And Glenn called, and his wife Ann called me immediately and said, come stay with us in Palm Springs, stay as long as you want to get things together. So their graciousness is allowing us to have a home, at least a roof over our heads for a few days while we figure things out. But it's quite a thing to realize that these are also, as I said earlier, not just stars and celebrities, they're friends, and they care. And that means more to us than anything really at this point.
I have known you for a very long time because, of course, the Canadian Brass got its start in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, a long, long time ago. And you are always unfailingly upbeat, tons of energy, hopeful, optimistic. I mean, that's the way you always are whenever I have been with you in the past. And I just wonder, Jens, I don't mean to be melodramatic with this question, but I just wonder how much of your guts have been ripped out by all this.
Thank you, Steve. You're right on all counts. We have known each other since my Canadian Brass days, and I do like to think that's who I am. I'm a happy person. I think all artists that ultimately live to serve the public do that because they are trying to embrace the audience. We're not taking, we're giving, and we are givers fundamentally. And it's very hard because I don't feel that at the moment. I know it's there, and that will return, and my outlet for getting back to being a giving human being and a giving artist is to actually throw myself into my work. I have a very important concerto that I have to play in 5 weeks. It was written by the great Wynton Marsalis, and it's the first time I've had a chance to play it. I have never felt a greater urgency to play a concert, to pour myself into my practice sessions, and to share that pain and that joy with an audience in 5 weeks in South Carolina. This is part of the healing process, and I know I'll bounce back to the person that you know. It's tricky to be that guy right now.
I understand. You've got myriad decisions. You and Jennifer have myriad decisions that you've got to make in the short run. I mean, starting with simple stuff like, where am I going to get clothes to wear tomorrow? Am I going to rebuild my house where it was, or are we going to move to another city, or am I going to move to a hotel? I just can't imagine what's on your plate right now. How are you figuring all that out?
Well, we are just now coming to the realization that we will be homeless for at least, I'm guessing, Steve, 12 to 14 months. There is no power in the Palisades. The village itself has been absolutely decimated. From my understanding and from the photographs I've seen, 70 to 75% of the town is gone. We were unfortunately a tiny little sliver up in the Palisade Highlands that got hit. All the homes around us were saved, and ours happened to be the unlucky one. So we have no illusions of going back quickly, and you start wrapping your head around the fact that you're essentially homeless. There has been no shortage of folks that have reached out to say anything you would like, any place you need to stay. And we and so many others that are in our situation in Los Angeles are grateful beyond words. Nevertheless, you do have to come to some reality that you have to base yourself somewhere. And Steve, I don't know where that's going to be. I just don't know right now.
Do you, I mean, it really looks like a bomb hit the Palisades. Can you imagine rebuilding and restarting life there?
That, you know, you can, the answer is yes, you can. And there's another side of it that says no, because the village that we know, the place that we knew is gone. We have had a lot of wonderful life-altering memories there. And to go back right now, my immediate answer to that is it's simply too painful. There's going to be a pre and a post-fire life. And those of us that live the pre-fire life will always have the post-fire to deal with. And I don't know if we're able to take that on emotionally. It's just too early. I could be wrong. I could change my mind. But right now, I just don't know.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time because you have to practice and you've got a lot of other stuff to do. So let me ask you one last question. And that is, what's the big lesson? What's the big takeaway that you are emerging from this catastrophe with?
Steve, you know better than most people what turbulent times we are in when it comes to humanity, when it comes to politics, the divisiveness that we're in. Not that this is about politics, but this kind of a situation is a lot like how artists like to present the arts. We are trying to bring people together. And if anything good can come out of this, and right now it's too early for any of that, it's that people should learn to draw together and be empathetic toward their fellow citizens. There's a softness that I truly hope is going to occur in the hearts of all. People that have lost everything, and people that know people that have lost everything, and people that don't know anybody that has lost anything, but perhaps will develop a degree of empathy. I think that's what I'm hopeful for.
That is a wonderful aspiration. I can't thank you enough for taking some time to be with us and to talk to, I'm sure, lots of people who are watching this that know you and are in your corner cheering for you as you rebuild your life. Jens, thanks so much.
Steve, I know I speak for everybody that has been devastated by this particular loss, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to tell our particular story. And thank you for remembering all of us that have been affected by this.
God bless and take care.
Thank you, Steve.
Having a child is complicated, and for the queer and trans community, fertility, conception, and family building present different kinds of challenges. Laine Halpern Zisman offers guidance for hopeful parents in her new book. It's called Conceivable, a guide to making 2S LGBTQ+ family. She is also an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Victoria in the School of Public Health and Social Policy and a certified fertility support practitioner at Birthmark. Oh my God, what a title. We have no time for the interview. Your title went on forever there. Laine, it's great to meet you. Nice to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
For people who cannot get pregnant on their own or who are having difficulty, what options are available here?
That is a great question. There's a lot of options, and I think sometimes people imagine that there's only one way forward, that there's a clear A to B, how to make a baby.
And there is not.
There is not a clear A to B. There are a lot of different methods we can try, a lot of different protocols, and there's a lot of different steps that people can take. So for 2S LGBTQ people, much of the time they don't know where to start, and that really is where the book comes in, to try to give people that little push of, here are some questions that you might ask, here are some different strategies you might try, and here are some questions you might ask yourself as well.
if you're queer or trans, and again, a lot of my questions today are going to seem hopelessly naive and ignorant, but we're all going to learn together through here. Is there a particular process you have to go through?
Yeah, so every family is different. There's no one way to make a family, and there's no right way to make a family. So different families have different configurations. Some of them, we know one thing for sure. To make a human, we need eggs, we need sperm, and we need a uterus. So depending on what combination of those things you have available will determine the steps that you might want to take. So for some families, they might have all three of those things readily available and they couldn't try at home. For other people, they might need to find a donor or a surrogate. And people might do that at home as well, or they might seek the help of a doctor and fertility clinic. There's a lot of people on a team, so you need a doctor. You should probably consult a lawyer, and need some mental health support too to help you navigate this journey.
This sounds complicated, is it?
For most people, it is, yeah. I think that we need a lot of support and we need a team. The process is made a lot easier by having those things available, by having people you can talk to, by having community, by having doctors you can ask questions to. That definitely makes it a little bit less complicated.
The doctors that you will want to talk to,
Yeah.
I presume if some of them are of a certain age, they will not necessarily have received a lot of training at med school in all of this. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest challenges is that we don't have a core curriculum on supporting 2S LGBTQ people in their family building journeys or in their medical journeys. There's been research to show that doctors don't have as much comfort providing care to transgender patients because they don't have that education. And I'll say from my own work, speaking with doctors and speaking with staff, their intentions are so good. There is such a desire to learn, but they don't necessarily have that education. So I think we really do need to focus on having that core curriculum for healthcare providers and support staff to support 2S LGBTQ people in their fertility and family building.
Gotcha. Let's do an excerpt from the book here. Sheldon, bring this up if you would, and I will read along for those listening on podcast. While access to equitable health care is a fundamental right that should be extended to all people in this country, implicit and explicit discrimination against 2S LGBTQ plus communities, both individually and systemically, often impacts the services and support they receive in Canada. The language used by staff and doctors, limitations of electronic medical records, and a lack of 2S LGBTQ plus training can all impact access to quality health care. Okay, let's talk about that. Give me some examples here of the kind of language that might be off-putting.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things is that oftentimes we're filling out forms, right? There's a lot of bureaucracy and forms that happen in any kind of medical setting. When you're filling out a form as an intended parent about your family, if that form says mother and father, and that's not the structure of your family, that can feel like the system isn't made for you. That can make you feel really excluded. But it also can make some legal implications, right? Like you're not a father and a mother. You might be two mothers. You might be two fathers. So ensuring that those medical records actually do, and those legal documents actually do represent your family structure can feel very important.
So instead of mother and father, what should it say?
Parent.
Parent one, parent two.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And I'll say a lot of fertility clinics are doing that work now. People are starting to look at their forms and assess the inclusion and equity of those forms to make it more inclusive. Having someone's name on a document that's different from their legal name will also create a more inviting environment. If you don't use your legal name, having a support person use that name to refer to you can be quite jarring. It can feel not just exclusionary, but oppressive to have someone refer to you the wrong way. So really ensuring that we have clarity in how we refer to people, in the pronouns we're using to refer to them, and in the written documents that refer to them as well is really important to create that equitable environment. This experience is so vulnerable for anyone, not just for LGBTQ people, but for anyone who's accessing a fertility clinic. there's so much emotion, there's so much vulnerability, there's so much grief that it becomes even more important to create an environment that feels like it includes you and that feels like it speaks to you. So I think that little extra effort of amending forms, speaking to people with the names that they use, that can make a huge difference in their everyday life.
Can I just follow up on that? The notion of not using your legal name. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, so some people might have a legal name that was from a gender that they don't identify as. Someone might use a different name. So their health card maybe hasn't been updated. There's so many steps that go into changing your name that sometimes our legal documents don't represent who we are. And that can, again, just feel very discriminatory.
Okay. Circling back to the first thing you said, which was there are rules in this province around surrogacy. You know, if you are unable to, for whatever reason, have kids yourself and you need to bring in a surrogate parent to help out, what are the rules around that in Ontario?
Yeah, so surrogacy is legal in Canada. However, there are regulations around using a surrogate. So you are not allowed to pay a surrogate in Canada. You are allowed to reimburse them for expenses. And you also are not allowed to pay someone to find you a surrogate. So it is complicated to find a surrogate in Canada, and the process can take quite a long time. There are people who, find a surrogate within 6 months, but there are other people who it takes 2 years to find a surrogate. Even though you can't pay a surrogate, reimbursing those expenses is quite a lot of money.
This sounds like a nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of arrangement, Okay, we're not allowed to pay surrogates, but, you had to drive to the hospital, so I'm going to reimburse you $100,000 for your taxi fees, right? I mean, that's how you get around that, presumably, isn't it?
No, not quite. So everything has to be reimbursed with a receipt. So we're not going to say you are driving from London, Ontario to Toronto, so I'm going to give you this money for that drive. We're going to say keep a receipt of keep an indication of your mileage. We're going to, after the fact, pay you back for every cent that you expensed, but we cannot pay you for that in advance.
Why? What would be the objection to paying for surrogacy? Because you got to admit that is like the ultimate gift you can give somebody, right? The gift of a life, of a child. What's the objection to paying people for doing that? Yeah,
there is definitely two sides to this argument, and I do not think it is a simple answer. So I think surrogacy is labor in many senses of the word, and I do think that labor should be compensated. I 100% agree with that. I think the fear is that someone would become a surrogate because they have no other employment, and they're doing it kind of for what we might think is the wrong reason. At the same time, everyone is an adult and can make consensual choices about their bodies. So I think that there is a lot of reason to question why we cannot pay a surrogate in this country. I do not think it's a simple answer. For myself, I think that we need to address bigger systemic issues around unemployment and poverty so that people are making the choice to be a surrogate because they want to be, not because they have to be. And in that case, then I do believe that it should be legal to pay a surrogate.
In the States, you can, right? You can pay surrogate mothers in the States.
Yes. Yes.
So that's one reason why the border still exists, I guess. Not the same policy in Canada and the United States. Are any fertility services and or surrogacy services or part of that whole thing covered by OHIP at all?
So there is a fertility program. So it's the Ontario Fertility Program does cover some fertility treatments, but it is not considered a necessary health treatment. So it's not covered by OHIP. It's covered by this fund. Recently, Ontario announced $150 million more would be put towards this. That has not come into effect yet, but it's $150 million over the next 2 years. Currently in Ontario, the funding allows each person to access one cycle of IVF. That does not cover the price of medications. Medications can cost $10,000. And so sometimes that one round of IVF is not enough. If you need additional rounds of IVF, then you might be paying out of pocket $20,000 depending on the clinic.
Any idea what percentage of people are lucky enough to have it work on the first go-around?
So it depends on a lot of factors. For IVF, depending on age and depending on diagnosis, you might be looking at a 30% success rate or a 50% success rate. I really try to avoid statistics in the book because it doesn't help the individual, right? If you don't fall into that number, then it's not going to change the outcome, right? So I try to veer away from statistics and think instead about the individual and how can we centralize that individual's story, that individual's needs, and that individual's preferences in their own experience navigating fertility.
So what you just said was the Ontario situation. Is it pretty much the same across the country?
No, every province is different. Some provinces have funding for fertility care and some provinces have none. What's also interesting is that some provinces have multiple fertility clinics and some provinces have one or none. So it changes the options that are available to you. Here in Ontario, there's quite a few fertility clinics, relatively speaking, to other provinces. So people might be able to kind of shop around and find the fertility clinic that works best for them. But in other provinces, they might only have one fertility clinic, and then it becomes a little bit more difficult to access your needs or to find things that meet your choices or preferences.
And forgive my ignorance again on this, but how many rounds of fertility can you go before you kind of realize it's not going to happen?
Yeah, again, that's something that's up to a doctor to speak with their patients about. Everyone is different, and everyone has a different kind of threshold. You know, for some people, one round of IVF is all they have in them emotionally, financially, physically. And for other people, they might do 5, 6 more rounds of IVF.
You could do that many?
Yes.
You can do as, really?
Yeah,
I mean,
think
anecdotally speaking, what's the most you've ever heard anybody do?
Quite a few. Yeah, I would say probably like 6 or 7, but there are people who definitely do more than that. When we're talking about a round of IVF, I'm talking about people doing egg retrieval. So IVF is the process of stimulating egg growth, retrieving those eggs, trying to develop embryos, and then transferring them back into the uterus. So that I'm referring to as one round. That is what's covered through Ontario's fertility program with any transfers of embryos that come out of that retrieval.
Okay, I don't normally ask people personal questions on this program, so we checked ahead of time, and apparently I have the green light to ask you some stuff about your own situation. Is that right?
Sure, yes.
Okay, I like to get on the record because, you know, sometimes if I do this, people are going to ask me after, well, how dare you ask her that kind of question? I want to let you know it's kosher. She gave me the green light here. Okay. Did you go through all this?
Yeah, me and my partner did. We did. When we started our process of trying to build our family, there was no information easily accessible. Our doctor, our GP, had referred us to a clinic that actually didn't fit the needs that we were looking for at the time. And we had to kind of go through the process of learning what options were available to us, learning the steps in the process. And I thought to myself, this is not okay. So I then became certified as a full spectrum doula and fertility support practitioner so that I could help people on their journeys of trying to navigate this system and identify what their preferences and their choices were.
So now, do you and your wife have kids now?
We do. We have 2.
You have 2 kids?
We do.
And again, if it's not too intrusive, how'd you do it?
Yeah, great question. So I am both a gestational parent, meaning that I carried our first child, and a non-gestational parent. So my wife carried our second child.
So we each had one.
We did, yeah.
Now that's true teamwork.
It is amazing. We're very lucky. Yeah, so we went through the process of trying with IUIs, with intrauterine insemination, and with IVF. We experienced some hardships along the way, as well as a chemical pregnancy, which is an early loss. And yeah, we have been very lucky in our experiences to come out of this with 2 children.
I need help translating. So miscarriages along the way? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, we had 1 miscarriage along
One miscarriage along the way.
Yeah.
Okay, and how many months in?
It was early.
Early.
Yeah.
Okay. And you have 2 kids now?
We do.
And the kids are how old?
3 and 7 months.
Oh, wow. Who had the 7-month-old?
My wife.
Your wife did. So this is 3 years in the rearview mirror for you.
Right.
And the kids are okay?
They're wonderful. Oh,
What gender?
we have a girl and a boy.
You got a girl and a boy.
Yeah.
Wow, you've covered all the bases. You're okay here. All right. Okay. This, you call it a journey? Mm-hmm. Is it something that you would recommend for others who find themselves in similar circumstances? Because, you know, I could understand how it might not be for the faint of heart, right?
Yeah, I think what I would recommend is building your community, find people to talk to, find support people, find community resources. Having that team to help you figure out what's best for you, what options you might be interested in pursuing is so essential. I think that team is what makes you feel supported, what helps you to advocate for yourself, and provides you with the education to learn about what you might choose to do.
Do the sperm donors know about this?
Do they know about?
The fact that their sperm helped create 2 children.
So there's different options for donors available to people. People could choose to have a known donor. They can choose to use a bank and use an entirely anonymous donor, or they can choose to use an open ID donor. An open ID donor is someone whose identity will be revealed only if the donor-conceived people choose to when they turn 18 years old.
And what did you do?
That's a personal question.
Okay, well, you've opened the door a little bit, so I just want to know. Okay, so leave that one alone. Yeah. Okay, I got you. See, I pick up on this pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, fine. Last question here. What do you think needs to be done in this country immediately to make this whole scene that we're talking about more reasonable, more doable, more equitable, all that stuff?
Yeah, so I think that we need more transparency in our protocols, more transparency in what options are available, more transparency in the financial costs and in the funding that's available. I also think we definitely need more healthcare provider education. And again, I think that our healthcare providers are invested in that and are interested in that, and I think we're starting to see change.
Well, congratulations to you and your wonderful family. Are you done?
Not yet.
You're going to have more kids, eh? You're going to have more kids.
I mean, we'll see, but I hope so.
Okay. And do you know who's going to have them? Like, do you arm wrestle to decide who's going to have them?
We might. Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's on. Laine Halpern Zisman has been our guest. The book is called Conceivable, A Guide to Making 2S LGBTQ plus Family. Thanks a lot for coming in tonight.
Thank you for having me.
In his latest book, author Daniel McFarlane argues that Lake Ontario has been neglected both environmentally and in spirit. The book is called The Lives of Lake Ontario, an Environmental History. He's also an associate professor in the School of Environment, Geography, and Sustainability at Western Michigan University, and he joins us now in studio. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Before we begin our conversation, let's start off with some quick facts about Lake Ontario. It is nearly 19,000 square kilometers in surface area, which makes it the smallest in surface area of the Great Lakes. It is 311 kilometers across, 85 kilometers in width, and as it stands was established about 11,000 years ago. It is also home to more than 55% of Ontario's population. This lake is huge when we look at those numbers, but not nearly as large as the other Great Lakes. And there are other lakes that are much grander in size that are not Great Lakes, but are bigger, like Great Slave Lake, Great Bear Lake, Lake Winnipeg, for example. Is Lake Ontario truly as great as the others? Does it stack up?
It is a great lake, all on its own. I mean, by a number of measurements. I mean, I argue in the book it's the most important Great Lake from a political, cultural, economic perspectives, right? As you mentioned, it's majority of the Ontario population is there. Something like a quarter of all Canadians live close to Lake Ontario. So this is, by many measurements, the most important of the Great Lakes. And then, yeah, it's also, pretty great in terms of its beauty. And
help me understand this. You live in America, you live in the States, you are Canadian, but you didn't grow up, you weren't born in Ontario.
Right.
Tell me, how did the fascination of Lake Ontario come about for you?
Right, well, my parents almost had me in Kingston, but then they moved to Saskatchewan before I was born, and then my dad's from Eastern Ontario, so we'd come out in the summers, so coming from a fairly dry province, I was always intrigued as a kid by all the water bodies out in Ontario, Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence, the Rideau and the Trent Canals and that sort of thing. And then when I went to Ottawa for grad school, that's when I first really started studying the history of the waters out here.
All right. Before we get into the history of Lake Ontario, you sent us a couple of photos. Let's have a look here. So this first photo here, these were taken from Chimney Bluffs State Park. This, for our Ontario viewers, is, I would say, directly across from Sandbanks Provincial Park on the other side of Lake Ontario. What are we looking at here? Because this looks quite sharp. but quite fascinating. What are we looking at?
Right, so this is a state park east of Rochester, so it's on the New York side, so Ontario folks may not be as familiar with it, but these are just sand formations that have been there for a long time, and it's protected as a state park. So where the picture's taken from, you can get that close, but you're not supposed to walk onto them actually, because they'd be a little vulnerable to people traipsing all over them.
We have a second photo that, again, shows these fascination. How did this form?
Well, it's a combination of wind and erosion and maybe some glacial past as well that sort of sculpts them in this way.
And how long, I mean, they're looking quite old. How long do we have an idea? And is this somewhere, can we see something like that elsewhere in Lake Ontario? Is that specific to that area?
Those types of formations are very specific to Lake Ontario. In terms of age, perhaps as old as, when the last glaciers left, which is, some 11,000 years ago.
All right. You talk about glaciers. I want to talk about something that you mentioned in your book, the Little Ice Age. Would you explain how that moment in time affected how Europeans settled here in Lake Ontario?
Right, so we're familiar with climate change today in terms of the climate getting warmer, but climate change has happened, of course, in the past, but that human society has had to adjust to. So the Little Ice Age is a period roughly from the 1400s into the mid-19th century where the climate gets a little bit cooler. And so I argue that was sort of a turnoff for European settlers to a certain extent, right? So that colder climate, it's good for thicker furs for the fur trade and things like that, but it requires adjusting. So perhaps that helped stave off sort of the settler invasion of indigenous lands for a long time. But then when that ice age is starting to thaw into the 19th century and things are getting warmer, that sort of goes hand in glove with European expansion.
Now, there were settlements there at that time as well.
Right, so there's already been, well before the Little Ice Age is over, we have some of the first settlements at, York and what's before York, which becomes Toronto, as well as at the Kingston end of the lake, where the Niagara River goes into the lake as well. So there's forts, European forts. And of course, there's many indigenous communities that predated all of that.
Well, let's talk about that. You also mentioned that what happened when Europeans met indigenous peoples and the effect they had on the population. How in turn has that affected the environment around the lake? Because that was something that you talk about in your book when we talk about the forests and sort of the agriculture there. When shifts happen, the lake gets impacted as well. So how does that look?
Right, so indigenous uses of the lake or of the area around it certainly predate Europeans. They were, they had agriculture, would cut down some forests, but their impact is fairly benign or done in a sustainable way. When Europeans start arriving, first diseases often move ahead of the Europeans, so decimating some estimates of, maybe 90% of indigenous peoples may have been exposed to death from diseases like that. So that clears the land to some extent, helping foster the misconception that this is land open for taking.
Right.
And so when Europeans are coming along, at certain points they do encounter a lake shore that isn't that populated. That's also has to do with, especially on the south side of the lake, with the Haudenosaunee groups that live there, often didn't keep their permanent camps right at the lake.
Right.
The kid would come there seasonally. So there was a bit of a misconception that this was land free for the taking, and of course that's sustained by European ideologies as well.
I think for most Canadians and people who live in Ontario, the lakes almost serve as have a functional purpose. I think we forget how far our history goes with this lake. How politically, I think that's an interesting one, how important is this lake when it comes to being Ontarian or Canadian?
Right, well, I suggest in the book, Canada might not be a country if it wasn't for Lake Ontario. So when you take the St. Lawrence River together with Lake Ontario, that forms the heartland of Canada from a historic perspective, right? Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, all the historical capitals of Canada that preceded Ottawa, where a lot of the first French and English settlers. And then that waterway provides a lifeline back to Britain as well, and then is a bridge and also a barrier between the U.S. So in many ways, Lake Ontario helps Canada become a separate country from the United States.
How about current day, present day?
Well, this is the North Shore of Lake Ontario is the most important part of Canada from a population, financial, industrial perspective. So it's still, in many ways, the heartland of Canada and the center from a population perspective.
All right, we have a couple of paintings that I want to show. Now, these paintings, the first one, are of locals who are hanging out at the waterfront. This is a painting of the steamship Chief Justice Robinson Landing, and passengers are actually getting off the ice. This is in 1852. And you can also see sort of in the foreground there, ice boats and horse-drawn sleighs on ice. I want to pull up another photo here. This is what many people would be familiar with, the Toronto Island. This is, you can see people out skating, having a good time there. What was the relationship like between early settlers and the lake?
Right, so both these paintings are of Toronto Harbor. So a lot of what that is showing is, well, it's before it gets too polluted in a way we might not recognize today, but communities face the lake. Right, they were centered on the lake. That was also the main means of transportation, so obviously by ships. But even in winter, in some ways winter, and this is where having the little ice age actually could help in some ways. Right. Now it becomes easier to travel by ice, so you see ice boating going on there, sleds, skating, all those different things, as well as ice cutting for, you know, underground refrigeration in the summertime. So the communities like what would become Toronto are focused on the lake, whereas they turn their back on the lake in more contemporary periods.
Well, let's talk about that. You know, I think people in Toronto kind of forget about the lake. You talk about that a little bit, you know, when we think about cottage season, you know, people aren't hanging out in Lake Ontario, for example. I was driving up Lake Superior, and every stop you can kind of pull up and have, you know, you can camp right on Lake Superior. But in Ontario, in Lake Ontario, we'd rather drive up to, you know, the Muskokas or Georgian Bay and hang out there. We kind of ignore it. What do you think that says about how the lake is used in the provincial capital now? Right.
Well, Lake Ontario, compared to the other Great Lakes, was in many ways turned into a working lake that we use for industrial purposes, that we put our pollution into. So in the minds of a lot of people, that's the lake that you use for those purposes, and then you leave Lake Ontario to go to a different Great Lake or to the Muskokas for your vacation. So it's partly reflecting the fact, yes, it arguably is the most degraded Great Lake because of what we've done to it, but at the same time, it's a perception of it's not a wilderness lake in the same way Lake Superior is or those other lakes.
There are probably people who are going to be watching this who are proud Lake Ontarian supporters and are probably sad to hear, you know, that. What kind of impact does, you know, it being a functional lake, a working lake, have on how it's being used?
Well, I think it led to the way Toronto organized its infrastructure, for example. It actually turned its back both literally and metaphorically, I think, on Lake Ontario in terms of building what's built at the waterfront, railways and then freeways and that sort of thing, actually blocking people from the lake, although we have seen people turning back towards the lake in recent times, and, you know, the greening of more of the lakefront as well.
Before we talk about the ecological impact, let's have a look at the expanse of Lake Ontario and its surrounding area. Here's Lake Ontario, and you should be able to see the major Canadian cities from the U.S. border moving along the shore up then toward the east. And so that's Niagara Falls, St. Catharines, Hamilton, Toronto, and towards Kingston. Now, here's the drainage basin, the area that feeds or empties into Lake Ontario, including Niagara Falls and the river that is at the tail end of Lake Erie and downstream in the Great Lakes system, the Trent-Severn Waterway, and rivers and streams coming from the area. And then here are the areas of concern, or the AOCs in Canada, that hover around the major cities along the lake. All right. What about Lake Ontario's geographic position is concerning for you in terms of what's happening to the lake environmentally?
Well, there's a few factors. One, it's downstream of the other Great Lakes, so a lot of that pollution gets passed along. It's also, of course, directly downstream from the Niagara River, which is a very heavily used industrial and electrochemical center, so a lot of bad pollution is coming in from that river. And then, of course, we've already talked about the heavy population and industrial uses in the GTA and around the lake. So all of that is just, you know, pouring toxics and pollutions into Lake Ontario.
One of the things that when we think about the Great Lakes, for a very long time, Lake Erie was kind of considered a dead lake. You know, we'd talk about sort of fires happening on the lakes themselves. How did Lake Ontario keep living, even as you mentioned geographically, we're downstream, we're the last ones, keep living, so to speak, because it's at the tail end of it?
Right. So in the 1960s, Lake Erie was often being declared dead because of pollution and eutrophication, which is the overgrowth of algae, which then befouls the water, uses up oxygen. A lot of the same thing was going on in Lake Ontario in this period, but because Lake Erie is shallower, it shows the effects more, so it was more noticeable. But that led to, pollution led to the first Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which only applied to Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, as well as the St. Lawrence.
How toxic did it get?
Well, that stage toxics, when we're talking 1960s, 1970s, aren't the big worry yet. We're not using as many of them, although we certainly were a lot then. Nowadays, toxics are the bigger worry. At that, in the 1972 Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement didn't apply to toxics, but the 1978 agreement, which came obviously a few years later, did.
All right, well, you mentioned a very important day when we talk about Great Lakes. April 1972, Richard Nixon, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Talk to me a little bit the significance here for Ontario. You talked about the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement.
Right. So what we have is the President and the Prime Minister signing this agreement, which is the culmination of, in many ways, decades of negotiations between the U.S. and Canada to try to come up with some agreement to address pollution within the Great Lakes. And in the 1972 agreement, it's the lower lakes, so Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. So that's working through what's called the International Joint Commission, which oversees bilateral water bodies. So this is an agreement to try to limit, especially things like phosphorus and nitrogen. Right? This is the baby boom period. People have all these new wonder machines.
Right.
They're using detergents in their dishwashers and their washing machines. That's causing problems in the lake. That causes that eutrophication that I mentioned earlier. So this first water quality agreement is very much about doing that. And it is fairly successful in cleaning up Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, at least visually in terms of a lot of algae. Part of that is because both countries spend a lot on building water treatment plants.
Right. I am curious, we celebrated 50 years only 2 years ago. Looking back now, how important was that agreement to the lifeline of Lake Ontario?
It's quite an agreement in that it's very much a groundbreaking international environmental agreement that has been seen as a model, I think, globally. So it probably kept things from getting a lot worse. We still never really lived up to it, but that's largely because both nations haven't kept up that funding past the 1970s or actually tried to bring industry to heel a little bit to stop the worst of that pollution.
Do you think we've done a good job on that? I want to push back a little bit on that.
No, I don't think we've done a good job. That 72 agreement was very important. 78 agreement as well. I mean, that's one of the first applications of the ecosystem principle, comes out of that agreement, but we absolutely have not lived up to it. And that's mostly Ontario as well as the New York State and the governments of Canada and the US not putting the money in to actually do what we need to be doing. So
what do we need to be doing?
Well, we've got the architecture in place to do what we need to do with those agreements, but I mean, there's a lot of direct and indirect things we need to be doing. So the amount of plastics and toxics that we're putting into the lake now are, overwhelming and egregious, but we refuse to, put sufficient limits on anything industrial that would hinder economic growth in any way. So a lot of it's wider societal things about not prioritizing environmental health.
I don't want you to point fingers here, but is there industries that we should be looking at that should have some stricter rules put in place when we're looking at possible solutions here?
Yeah, certainly anything to do with fossil fuels, plastics, and then in the Niagara region, a lot of the chemical companies and things like that. But it's also, the cumulative impact. A lot of it comes from agriculture and fertilizer and runoff. It's much easier to deal with point source pollution, which was what that first Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement did, but non-point source is much harder to deal with, and so we're not doing effective jobs of policing that.
I am curious, in terms of, you mentioned policing, how does one enforce something like this when we have this vast body of water that is shared between two nations? We do have bodies that are there, but how hard is it to kind of enforce these rules?
Well, it's very difficult. We actually do have some decent regulations, so a lot of the time it's not actually enforcing them is the problem. But beyond that, we certainly have stronger regulations. I mean, if we look at what is being done to human health as well as ecosystem health, even if you want to measure it by economic impacts instead of just health impacts, often those impacts are more negative than the benefits that come from economic activity, but because we prioritize industrial and economic uses and, sort of the magic formula of economic growth and GDP above all else, that comes before ecological and human health.
I feel like if we're to grade all of the Great Lakes, you probably are going to grade Lake Ontario right at the bottom there. I'm just curious, how is the lake now? What are some of the issues that you think should be brought to focus? Because I know in your book you talk a lot about microplastics as well and some other issues, but what is kind of the main concerns for you?
Yeah, we have improved in terms of some of the conventional pollutants. There's less of some heavy metals such as mercury. things like that have been, or DDT, some of those things, were outlawed. You still see legacy contaminants in the sediments. But now we have a lot of new things. So a lot of researchers in the last 10, 20 years have been uncovering just how big of an impact plastics are in terms of not only being in sediments, but they get inside living things and then bioaccumulate to move their way up. Plastic is often toxic as well. PFAS is sort of that new forever chemical that's come onto our radar screens only in the last decade or so because it lasts so long and can bioaccumulate as well. So those are sort of some of the tip of the iceberg, or really outstanding, or really apparent types of pollutants that we're now dealing with.
I do have to ask, just talking with some of our colleagues, just how we have a little bit of a battle here when it comes to which are our favorite lakes. We have a few people who love Lake Superior, some who are diehard Lake Ontarians, but I don't hear a lot of people going into Lake Ontario. I love going into Lake Ontario. If I can, I will. I'm in at Coburg Beach. It's one of my favorite places to go. When's the last time you dipped your toes into Lake Ontario? Is this something that you encourage and do?
I absolutely encourage. Last year, or actually this past summer was the last time I was in Lake Ontario. Down near Niagara on the lake, as well as at Sandbanks. So we tried to, as I was writing this book, we tried to explore a lot of the different parts of Lake Ontario. And you're right that a lot of people sort of turn their noses historically at going into Lake Ontario, but there's always been a diehard community that would do that. And I think during the pandemic that really increased a lot too. So now you see people using the Toronto Islands a lot more, and there's a push to make that more available to the public and create more beaches.
We have about a minute left, and I have to ask this question because you now live on the other side of the border. So, with Trump as president-elect, he has openly stated that the administration is going to tap Canada's water. Should Ontarians and Canadians be worried about the future of Lake Ontario? I don't know how feasible that statement is, but should we be worried about one of our Great Lakes?
Yeah, well, we need to be worried about everything environmental with the Trump presidency. There is something called the 2008 Great Lakes Compact, which theoretically puts some legal limits on other states from the U.S. being able to divert water. But Trump's, of course, a wild card on a lot of these issues. So I don't know how feasible it would within the next 4 years for him to do that, but it's certainly something to stay worried about and stay vigilant about.
Fair enough. Daniel, I want to thank you so much for coming into studio. Really great book and really great dive into the history of Lake Ontario. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, January 16th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, John Michael McGrath and yours truly on the continuing fight against Trump tariffs and the very strong possibility of an early election call next month. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.